Pines. So the actual title of this entry in the 1859 May of Atlantic Monthly is In the Pines. So a gentleman is taking a trip exploring the pines. Getting there is usually the funnest part of the getting there, right? So here we go, real quick. It is a region aboriginal in savagery, grand in the aspects of untrammeled nature, where forests extend in uninterrupted lines over scores of miles, where we may wander a good day's journey without meeting half a dozen human faces, where stately deer will bound across our path and bears dispute our passage through the cedar brakes, where in a word we may enjoy the undiluted essence, the period wildness of woodland life. Deep and far under the shade of melancholy boughs, we shall be taken, if together we visit the ancient pines of New Jersey. That's kind of an introduction to the pines and as he's going. And then he sums up his trip, and I'm just going to share a quick excerpt here, which kind of sets the tone for this conversation. So it says, we shall not suffer his company much longer in this world. Poor, neglected, palatable, darkened, and that he is, this fellow citizen of ours, he must move on, for civilization, like a stern, prosaic policeman, will have no idlers in its path. There must be no vagrants, not even in the forest. The once free and merry greenwood, our policeman civilization says, nay, the forest even must keep a moving. We must have farms here, and happy homesteads, and orchards heavy with promise of cider, and wheat golden as hope, instead of silent aisles and avenues of mournful pine trees, sheltering such forlorn miscreants as our poor cranberry-stealing friends. Railways are piercing the pines, surveyors are marking them out in imaginary squares, market gardeners are engaging land, and farmers are clearing it. The rat is driven from point to point, from one means of subsistence to another, and shortly he will have to make the bitter choice between regulated labor and starvation clean off from the face of the earth. There is no room for a gypsy in all our wide America. The rat must follow the Indian, must fade like breath from a window pane in winter. And that gentleman writing in Atlantic Monthly was talking about the people of the pines, which is what our conversation is going to be about today. And one other, I like to meet in person, but something else, this kind of ties in with our conversation too. So we started out with the description of the pines being a magical place, and then the people of the pines not having quite the reputation that it's upstanding and something that you want to be associated with. But then also a tie-in, this bronze medallion from 1873 that was given out to people of merit who won at the World Fair in Vienna, who won take first place. You can find these, very rare, but anywhere from $300 to $1,500. So where does this tie in with the local people of the pines, and also that conversation that Atlantic Monthly reporter talked about the pines? We'll get there. I'm going to share my screen real quick. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes, looks great.
Okay. And let's hope hopefully the audio will be well too. Okay, so William J. Lewis, author of New Jersey's Lost Piney Culture. I always like to start with a photo of my family, and also a picture of not too long ago, but Beardless Bill, I guess, is in the middle there in the pink shirt. And I travel quite a bit for work, and I work for the federal government. And usually when I go places, I'm giving presentations, and I'm an agent of change. I'm updating IT systems and training individuals on the different systems that are behind the government firewall. And most people don't like change, so I always put a picture of my family up there, let them know I'm here to do a job just like you guys are, and not to throw no tomatoes. and we're virtual today, so I don't have to worry about that, right, guys? But so my lovely daughter on the left of the screen, the tallest one is Chloe Lewis. She's a D1 softball pitcher at the University at Albany. On the right side there, the short one, my oldest daughter, she graduated Marymount University, Donnell. And then my lovely wife on the end there is Christina. So that's a family of mine. I work for the federal government, like I say. I've been a lifelong New Jersey resident, except for when the military, the Marine Corps took me out. And I lived in Hawaii, of all places, for 3 years, I guess. But I've traveled the world once I got outside out of the military in the 90s. I've been to the Horn of Africa, Germany, Japan, Korea, England. I came back to New Jersey and specifically in the Pine Barrens to raise my family when I got out of the Marine Corps. And then from there, I founded a 501c3 in New Jersey, trying to get kids outdoors called Nest for about 8 years. I've served on multiple nonprofits, board of directors. I graduated Rider University. After I got out of Rider University, I started writing. I've produced pretty successful books. This book here that we're talking about, New Jersey's Lost Piney Culture, hit #1 on Amazon when it debuted in January 2021. So I'm one of those country bumpkins, the Pineys that we're going to talk about here. So New Jersey's Lost Piney Culture. Just to start with a short story about that. I guess about 2 years ago, wife and I were driving up to Albany to see my daughter in Albany, New York. And I got a phone call, and I was in the passenger side of the car. And a woman was on the phone, and I usually don't answer calls that I don't know the number, right? Because they're usually spam calls. But I happened to pick up the phone and just listen. And the woman was on the line, and she started asking me, "Are you a real life Piney?" That was her first question. "Are you a real life Piney?" And I could tell I was on speakerphone, so I thought I was being, one of those crank calls, and I wasn't really going to take it seriously. And I was going to get ready to hang up the phone, and the young lady said, "No, don't hang up." And then a gentleman joined the conversation and said, "We're out here in Quaker, PA, and we're trying to tell our friends that Pineys still exist. And we saw your name, we Googled it, and we saw your name and your number. So we gave you a call. And we want to know if Pineys still exists." And I happened to say, "Well, I'm just getting ready to publish my first book, New Jersey's Lost Piney Culture. So I think you got the right person. And I'm a pretty good person, subject matter expert on the topic. And you can order the book." So they went ahead and ordered the book and proved to somebody out there that the Pineys still exist. So the question is, Pineys exist, and what is the classic definition of a Piney? The Piney that my grandfather was, and am I a different type of Piney today? And that's what the research was generated for this book. So you remember that 1873 bronze medallion that I showed you earlier on? A gentleman named H. Augusta Kreskin actually wrote a book in the 1800s, and he was a gentleman that actually helped America establish the dry flower industry. An industry, he was in Cincinnati, Ohio, but he had won those bronze medals around the world at world fairs. And at those world fairs, kings and queens sat in an industry that was established that's never really been written about and never really gotten any clout in our Americana and our society. It's a dry flower industry. And he won medal after medal with his displays and his techniques on drying flowers. And he had his start in the 1860s. And that ties directly to the Piney culture that we're going to talk about here. So here's an image of 1873 Vienna, where at the World Fair, Mr. Kreskin, he won a medal, one of those medals that I showed you earlier on. He won several medals for his dry flower industry. And at the time, the King of Prussia came by his stand, and actually he was quoted as saying, in German, but he was quoted as saying that what we have here is the beginnings of a national industry. And it's an industry that today people think of the Pine Barrens and industries in the pines. They think of bog iron, they think of glassworks, cranberry culture, maybe blueberries. but they don't think about the dry floral industry. But it was an industry that lasted all the way up until the early 1990s. And it was an industry that supported hundreds of local piney families. But if we go back to the short excerpt that I read from the Atlantic Monthly, the local Pineys, there wasn't very much niceness being said about the local Pineys. And here it is. I introduced myself and said that I'm not the same type of Piney that my grandfather was. So I'm telling you in the world that I'm a Piney. I'm a Piney in the 21st century. So what does that mean to me? When I started doing the research for this book, I read a very famous book, and in my opinion, that book saved the pinelands of today by John McPhee in 1967, published by John McPhee, titled The Pine Barrens. But I read that book not too long ago in 2018 for the first time ever. And I was introduced to the word piney and it being a derogatory, kind of like, nothing nice to say and kind of fighting words when somebody would call you it. And also, he had kind of mentioned some stories, but he left out a lot of funny stories that I grew up with. And as I looked around my own family, I thought to myself, maybe ignorantly, somebody's going to write a story in the history of the Pineys. It should be somebody that actually is a Piney. Everybody knows John McPhee was from Princeton, New Jersey. So I started my research then, and I had to come across this article here from the Boston Evening Transcript. Picture it, not a slow news night like a Wednesday or a Thursday, but a Saturday night. This is the headline news in the Boston Evening Transcript, June 28th, 1913. And it reads, New Jersey degenerates, terrible conditions found by Governor Fielder among the Pineys, who's advocating for segregation and sterilization of those people in the pines. That's kind of was a shock to me when I read that. And there's several other articles, national articles out there, all echoing the same political line, which happens to be Governor Fielder was running for re-election that year. And it just happens that he won re-election, and his only platform issue was the Pineys and saving the state from the Pineys. So there's that negative connotation to the word piney. And we know this is what really popularized it, because this made the headline news. We had a governor that told the state he was going to save them, and it made national headline news. So it really echoed across the land. And for the longest time, people did not want to be considered to be called a piney. They were actually fighting words to a lot of people because they believed, or they knew other people that believed what the term was and how they were using it by this Governor Fielder and the people of the day like Dr. Goddard and Elizabeth Kite. Any questions on that? So it's a very dark history. We don't have to go very far in New Jersey. Just look in our own backyard, the basis of the eugenics movement and of putting labels on people and how that affects the people, to where there's people like me here today saying that this myth of the degenerate, the feeble-minded Pineys that were in that 1.1 million acres, that's a whole lot of swath of land in New Jersey. 25% of the acreage. It's only roughly 25 miles from the capital in Trenton. And we had a governor there telling everybody in the state he was going to segregate southern New Jersey, and specifically the Pinelands where the Pineys were, because of their immoral behavior, their degeneracy. And he actually won election on that platform issue. And if you think about today, when people ask me, so was the governor successful back then? He had two things, right? One, he wanted to sterilize the people so that they didn't become more wards of the state. Well, sterilization in 1911 was one of the laws that was passed, so it was legal for the sterilized feeble-minded people. But that law got kicked out by the Supreme Court in like 1914, 1915. So nobody ever got sterilized in New Jersey. But his other policy, which he put in place, was to segregate southern New Jersey, and specifically the Pinelands. If you think about it, the New Jersey Garden State Parkway or the Turnpike, they do not go through the Pinelands, they go around the Pinelands. So there was a lot of policy. He even instituted a committee to study how he could segregate southern New Jersey and protect the people and the citizens. Remind you, though, the rights and the the attitudes towards the local people in the pines, because they lived a little bit differently. They lived very rural. We're very similar to the people of Appalachia, or the mountain people in the Ozarks, where those people, have put a label, people put a label on them, and all of a sudden they consider them to be bad people or different, or they warn their children to keep away from them. The same thing happened in New Jersey to the people of the pines. John McPhee also introduced me this character in the book, The Classic Definition of a Piney, and his name is Bill Watzowicz. And actually one of the most famous Pineys, because even today the newspapers will say he's the last living Piney, and that he was featured in the National Geographic. Life magazine did a couple pages article on him, the last living hermit. And whenever the newspapers want to talk about Pineys, I usually run over to his place out in Woodsmansey and do an interview. There's featured here on the left is what classically people called Pineys, or those people like Bill is doing there, pulling pine cones down Warren Grove on the plains, the pygmy pines of New Jersey. One of the most fascinating places in the pines. And then on the right there is Bill, featured with my nephew and myself. I had to search him out and look for Bill to help with the research on what is the classic definition of a piney. I know what John McPhee introduced me to, somebody that was living in the area, that was working and living closely to the land, working cyclical industries like cranberries, picking cranberries in the fall, pulling pine cones in the winter, come summer, picking blueberries. But there was a lot more to it than just that. Even in Tuckerton, which you guys, I think some of you people joining us today are from Tuckerton area. Even in Tuckerton, we had Pineys that were pulling pine cones and working that same cycle of dry flower items that Bill Watzowicz was earlier on when John McPhee wrote about him in the 60s. Here we see a picture on the left of a big pile of pine cones. So pine cones, if you don't know, pine cone picking, or pine balling as they call it, you actually go out to Warren Grove where the pine trees don't grow no more taller than 5 feet. And you actually have a bucket around your neck, and you're walking through the plains and you're pulling pine cones. And as you pull those pine cones, you fill up these feed bags, which then these pine cones went into that dry flower industry. Ultimately, somebody would artificially open them, and they would go into either making wreaths, either put into a bowl with cinnamon sticks around the holidays. People, you can see them today and purchase them, but they're not New Jersey pine cones per se. They're imported pine cones. But all the way up to the early 1990s, this industry existed, and pine cones were just one of 101 different plants that were part of that industry that helped sustain local piney families, by the hundreds of piney families. This is just one gentleman on the right here in this image, Major Leaks, who wasn't a major in the military. That was happened to be his name, but he was pulling pine cones and wheeling them out of Warren Grove. But remember when I talked about the pinelands being 1.1 million acres, and that map that I showed you earlier from the Pinelands Restoration Alliance, that map showed that once they put that border around the pinelands, 25% of the acreage of New Jersey, removing pine cones from Warren Grove became illegal. That was something that the local Pineys continued to do all the way up to the 1990s, and they did it at the risk of getting fined or ticketed. So something that you were taught generationally as a means of income, whether it be just simply doing it on the weekends and filling the gap in the family budget, or full time, like my grandfather, the only job he ever had was working that woodland cycle, or what we like to call the Richardson calendar, pulling these different plants, pulling pine cones and other plants and grasses that ultimately wound up in the dry flower industry and went directly to New York City and Philadelphia. So those people that worked at Richardson calendar, they had a certain knowledge set. Local people knew the landscape a lot more well than people do today. They were very close to it, very intimate to it. Early botanists actually hired local Pineys to take them out to places so that they could discover different plants, curly fern grass, is a very popular, very most people know what that is. That was a very endemic plant to the Pinelands area, and Pineys would take people out to see these different plants. And so that knowledge set that they had was something that was coveted by some people, certain people, but yet they were also demonized for living a different lifestyle. For living out in the middle of the pines, living remotely, very independent, very free-spirited people, not as educated as people, I would say, are today, which the rest of the country was in the same spot. We were shifting from agriculture based to more industrial, where today in the 21st century, a lot of people, a majority of people are knowledge workers. My grandfather, who worked this Richardson counter and pulled pine cones, he couldn't read or write. But today, you heard my intro, I'm a 21st century Piney, but I went to Rider University. I have a degree. I'm a little bit more educated than my grandfather was. But he had a knowledge set that people today still covet. People want to know inside of that Richardson calendar, those plants are part of the dry floral industry, which ones are edible or which one are medicinal. That's a knowledge that they don't teach in school anymore. But is the word piney, so they're not just simply come through bumpkins, and they're not scary people, but is it still a bad word? Somebody sent me this image not too long ago. They were inside of a brick Barnes and Nobles, and they saw my book next to a couple other books, and in the line, subliminally, in their mind, it was really highlighting, the mob, shark attacks, and decay, and a book about New Jersey's lost piney culture, which is really about the traditions and the culture of the people. Why would that be in that lineup? It seems to be the message is that it's not something to be proud of. It's not something that should be, that evergreen thread that's being weaved into our historical tapestry. Maybe that evergreen thread of the piney shouldn't be there. But then if it's something that shouldn't be proud of, yet I'm out here saying I'm proud to be a piney. And if you've been in the pines at all, you might have encountered somebody on their bumper of their car that said, "I'm proud to be a piney." Sometimes Piney Power pops up, or Piney Tribe. So people today are proud of their culture and their history in the area. So that word kind of migrated from the early 1900s being a very derogatory term, almost like the N word today, to being people accepted it. People started wanting to be part of that culture, and you can find people that move from Staten Island today to the Pine Barrens and fall in love with that Pinelands and don't want to be seen or buried anywhere else. That's where they want to wind up. So they've really literally become a type of piney. I have a clip here, a 7-minute clip that I'm going to play, and it actually, hopefully the audio is working properly, but it's part of a documentary film that we just submitted based off of this book that's going to the Garden State Film Festival. So let's see if the audio works. Sounds good?
We can't hear it, actually.
All right, so let's check that out.
And our here because of the book that brought us together, helped us understand our differences. And this book, New Jersey's Lost Piney Culture by William J. Lewis, talks about the different types of pineys that there are in our area here. One of the first times that I met Ken, he was fishing, and he was all dressed in camo, and I thought to myself, why is he in a uniform and fishing, looking like he needs to be hunting? And so I asked him, and from that day on, we've been together for 15 years, and we are very different people. In the story where we looked at different types of pineys, and I most identify with the tree-hugging piney, the kind of person who is a transient. I came from Long Island originally, and I never went back. And Ken grew up in Turnersville?
Turnersville, South Jersey. Always been in South Jersey.
And now lives in Chatsworth. So he's part of the hunting, fishing culture. And I came to school here in 1977, and I've been here ever since. And 15 years ago we met, and we're still together today.
The hunter Piney, many a shotgun-toting young man, came to the Jersey Pines to hunt game animals like ducks, deer, foxes, and bobwhite quail. They established hunting clubs and had hunting cabins in their territories and came down and stayed during the hunting season. The love of the land eventually gets a strong hold on many of these outsiders and turns them into insiders and year-round residents. Not to be confused with a woods piney. Many of these hunters adopted their work to support their love of hunting, with some even becoming pine cone pickers. Note author John Richardson in the book Pinelands Folk Life first described in general terms someone who decided to stay in the pines, those who could live within the seasonal rhythms of the place.
The tree hugger Piney. Someone who takes a photo of Lake Apsigami and captures the pristine landscape and never wants to see it altered, just like a snapshot in time. Today, we call them environmentalists and conservationists. Many flock to the area and continue to do so, seeking glimpses of the unique flora and fauna. Possibly without their help, we wouldn't have the pines we have today.
The company Piney, a leftover family in the Jersey Pines that worked for generations from one bust industry to another. Later, the local workforce was stabilized by farming. Both the owner of small and large farms and their loyal employees who worked the land are included here. Prime examples are the Ocean Spray folks who lived and died as company men. We're sure they did well for themselves and mean no negative connotations. Like the highly adapted pine tree that makes up the Pine Barrens, it suffers fire and is reborn and survives to regrow. The company Piney has learned to do the same.
The educated Piney. Those natives who were well off enough and had the smarts it took to go off to college. Sometimes they came back and stayed in the Jersey Pines. And lots of times they just visited.
The Conway Twitty Piney. Conway Twitty was Granny Lewis's favorite guitar player. At White's Bog Blueberry festivals, she always liked the country and bluegrass bands, and as far as she was concerned, any person who could strum an instrument or carry a tune who lived in the Jersey Pines was a Twitty Piney.
The out-of-town Piney with boat slip. Lots of folks who are rich enough to have a second home located in the Jersey Pines tend to have money for a boat as well. Whether you like it or not, we all came to the area at one time or another. The closeness to Philly and New York has had a major influence in shaping the area. A few of us are proud to wear the title of Piney, just like the rest of us, and the rest of us welcome them to do it.
The firefighter Piney. Fire and the pines go together like peanut butter and jelly, and the same could be said about the South Jersey firefighter. Whether fighting wildfires year-round, protecting their neighbors, or fighting fire in their own backyards, their sense of service to the region is admirable. This was not always a full-time paying job, but it is a full-time work when a fire catches. The volunteer firemen and the fire stations supporting them become 24-hour fixtures of the Piney landscape.
The patriotic Piney. The New Jersey Pines has a large chunk of it contained behind big governmental fences, where thousands of men and women are trained to be in the armed forces. A lot of those folks who came to the area from around the United States retired in New Jersey, happy and content to live in their adopted state, finding solace in the open space and the many opportunities to fish, trap, and hunt in the pines.
This type was never really described by Granny Lewis, so the author here is injecting his interpretation to describe Granny herself. Poor enough to afford a tub of lard and a loaf of white bread, This Piney would make hard sandwiches for lunch. The woods Piney depended on the woods to provide the family with a wage to live by. Whether the men ran beat-up pickup trucks through the woods looking for scrap junk cars or hauling a load of pine cones from the plains, you betcha they didn't care what you called them. With fried snapper meat from snapping turtles caught fresh out of the flowering creeks, or deer shot year-round to keep the fridge full, the Piney did what he could to get by. There are many reasons for the word reluctant to be used to describe these Pineys. As the times were changing and full-time employment took them out of the woods, they were reluctant to go, but progress crawled up to them. They were reluctant to leave the generations of woods work, but now they had to adapt or become extinct.
So what you heard there, is a direct reading from New Jersey's Lost Piney Culture of the 10 different types of Pineys, which is my attempt to show people that the diversity of the pinelands and the word piney itself has evolved and broadened to what it used to be, where we classically call, like Bill Wasowitz was a pinecone picker and a sphagnum moss raker, and he worked blueberry industry and cranberry industry, but that's all that they did. Well, today a lot of the industry, especially the dry flower industry, doesn't exist anymore. As I said before, my grandfather's only job was to work that industry year round, whether it be January pulling pine cones or in the spring pulling different types of grasses like peppergrass and pennycress. But that piney and that lifestyle, that doesn't exist anymore. Today, it's broadened to include people that, a tree hugger piney that goes down to the pinelands and loves to take pictures. I myself associate with the tree hugger piney because I love to be out in the middle of a bog taking pictures of rare endangered orchids and lots of other wildflowers that are out there. So it's definitely evolved to what it used to be and what it is today. But without the evolution, the word itself wouldn't be able to be used anymore. And that would disconnect a lot of the culture and traditions of the piney of old to the piney of today. And those people that we see here on this slide, New Jersey Pine Barrens 21st Century Explorers, all these people in here are a type of a piney. And most of them would say, if you ask them directly, are you a type of piney? They would say, yes, I am a piney. And they would be proud of that. Even though there's still that negative stereotype still goes around to where I'll be at a book signing event and dad will come up and say, I remember as a kid, not too long ago, mom and dad would say, as we were going down Route 539 to the Jersey Shore, keep your windows rolled up and your doors locked or those Pineys will get us. And I hear those stories all the time about that negative stereotype rearing its head, but you can see a great group of people here that are very representative of the diversity of the pines and the people of the pines. And as I was doing the research for this book, talking about, I knew what the 101 different plants that were part of the dry flower industry, because that was something that I was part of growing up. But I discovered all these other things out here that the world says New Jersey Pinelands is very unique. The United Nations itself, as a UNESCO, as an organization, designated the Pinelands of New Jersey as a world biosphere. Congress in Washington, D.C. said that this needs to be preserved, and they made it a federal national reserve, one of the first in America. So it's a very special place, and some of the plants out there that you can't see anywhere else are just amazing to see in person. And when they call it the New Jersey Pine Barrens, which I'm off to call it the New Jersey Pine Barrens, just for it's just funny to me to say it's barren when I can see all the color that we see on this slide. The bottom right corner, the Jersey status there, the purple with my hand cusping that status, that's something that you can see if you go out to Seven Bridges in Tuckerton around September. It'll be in full bloom and the whole salt meadow will be a purple bloom. It's just amazing to see in person. And that's also one of the 101 plants that were part of that Richardson calendar that the Pineys collected and sold to the dry flower industry. But still, the misnomer that the Pine Barrens is barren, and that the word piney and the people of the pines are backwoods people, it just shows that we're both misunderstood, both the people of the pines and the pines itself. Here's an image of 9 different types of plants that are part of that 101 plants of the Richardson calendar. Again, these were done year round, whatever they were, whether it be birch poles or whether it be hoghuck, which is a type of a blueberry brush, the grasses, pennycress, and pennygrass, peppergrass, I mean, those all went by the truckloads into the dry flower industry. It was a superb industry that sustained hundreds of local piney families. And the titans of those industries, one of the titans, Jack Richardson, which is the Richardson calendar named after, you know, that gentleman, there should have been a movie put out about his life and his life working with the local Pineys and how that industry wound up in Philadelphia, where today the same street in Philadelphia that was a dry floral market is a fresh cut market. It's not that far, not long ago, that you can see the things that the Pineys did in this industry. When people bring up an industry and they say, what's the pinelands and the people of the pines famous for? They usually say bog iron, because it's, in my opinion, historians, and usually historians are male, they like to write about war. And bog iron is connected to George Washington and winning America's independence. And that is fine, but it's not the only thing that New Jersey should be known for. Bog iron was a very short-lived industry. It died out in the early 1850s. And eventually this industry picked up, and John Richardson made it what it was all the way up into the early 1990s. And it stretched all the way across the pinelands and even outside the pinelands. So where does the Pineys tie to Mount Holly? Because Mount Holly is not inside of the designated border of the 1.1 million acres. That is not one of the municipalities that part of the 56 that were within the New Jersey Pinelands. But at a time in Mount Holly, if you're not familiar with the history of Mount Holly, there was a grandstand and a grandiose fair, which lasted nearly 20 plus years, 1856, 1926, more than 20 plus years, that sitting presidents went to. Even the local rail had a rail line that built into the fairgrounds in Mount Holly, just to have people from visiting cities, whether it be Philadelphia and New York City, go to that fairground. So where does that tie to the Pineys? We're getting there. So John Richardson was from Mount Holly for a short stint. That's where his mother raised him and his sister and brothers. You're pictured here, John Richardson, for the first time on the left, in 1945 with his nephews on Pine Street in Mount Holly, New Jersey. He wound up purchasing the Mount Holly Fairgrounds after years and years of disrepair. It was abandoned, no longer a world fair at that grounds. And he actually brought it back, and he actually got issued a certificate to be able to run trotting horses at the Mount Holly racetrack. And all the while he was doing that, he had local Pineys still coming to him at that location and bringing him truckloads of cattails, foxtails, birch poles. And he would load them up in Mount Holly and take them short drive over to Philadelphia and to the market that he sold to. But the work that he did with the Pineys helped him purchase this property and also bring back, for a 10-year span, the Mount Holly Fairgrounds of old. And there's nothing written out there at all about John Richardson, except for the fact that in 1945, he purchased the Mount Holly Fairgrounds. Today, we often think of history, and we're always looking for something that we can see. You know, Tuckerton does a wonderful job, and I'm very jealous of Tuckerton for the Baymen. They have a museum, the Tuckerton Seaport Museum, right? And the Baymen, the lives, the culture, the traditions, they're on display for people to see, to learn, and also to adhere to, you know, that psychosis, that part of society, that people were part of that landscape. Where the Piney, there is no Piney Museum out there. Most people don't know that there was a dry flower industry, and that industry sent truckloads of different types of plants out of New Jersey all the way down to Virginia, or even out west. And that New York City and Philadelphia had floral markets, but they were dry floral markets. nobody knows anything about those Pineys. The only thing that we know about is the eugenics movement and that negative stereotype that early on in the 1900s was started. And it still sticks to people today, like any great myth. People still are cognizant of that term, using it in a derogatory. But John Richardson was a titan that should be known about. One of the chapters of New Jersey's Lost Piney Culture is kind of a biography of John Richardson and the Pineys that worked at Richardson Calendar. And like I say, history itself, it's just wiped away, and there's no presence anywhere of the Piney that you can look to and learn about their traditions and their culture and the dry flower industry. If you look in the top left corner here, if you can see my mouse, the only thing that we know of the Mount Holly Fairgrounds where sitting presidents and vice presidents and people across the East Coast went to is the name Mount Holly Fairground Plaza. Today it's paved over and there's an Acme sitting where the racetrack used to be. And that history is gone. The only way you can know the history of the land and the people in the area is by picking up a book. And it's a real shame, but it's progress, right? Things change and people change, industries change, but it's still our history. And the more we know about our history and the people of our past, the more connected we are to the land that we live in today. It's something I really deeply believe in as a historian, Pine Barrens historian. So to wrap up, I think we're doing great on time for the end to wrap off the book and all that good stuff. But history connects us to the land and the people. Awareness breeds empathy and dispels negative stereotypes. Remember that negative stereotype of the Piney. Hopefully every person I meet that has an inclination to think of the negative of the Piney, when they meet me, I change their minds. Or if they read the book, New Jersey's Lost Piney Culture, it changes their mind about the people of the Pines. And Pineys do exist today because you and I exist. I'm sure there's a few people on the line. I've met hundreds of Pineys over the last couple of years of going to book signing events and stuff like that are very proud of who they are and proud of where they come from. Pineys of old worked the Richardson calendar, that 101 different plants. That is very well documented in my book. And like I say, you and I are history in the making. And who knows, one day they might be writing a book about your lifestyle, your traditions, and your culture. And it's a good thing, because if not, like paradise, it'll get paved over and it'll get forgotten. Thank you, everybody.
Excellent. Thanks so much, William. We have time for some questions, either in the chat box, or you can take yourself off mute and ask your question if you'd like. Give you guys a couple of seconds to think of any questions.
Yeah, my name's Alan Cox. I'm from the Coxes in Joyestown. I signed in because I used to fight forest fires there in your area and hunt deer. So I've always had a heartfelt. Well, I wouldn't be in this forum if it wasn't for the memories that I had back in the days that I lived in that area. So thanks a lot. I appreciate your time, and I certainly will get your book. God bless.
Thank you, Alan. And you can get that book down at the Tuckerton Seaport Museum if that's your local area. And I like to say to people, remember we saw Gina on that 7-minute film earlier, that film clip. The Pine Barrens of New Jersey is the proverbial cowboy hat. When people come to the Pines, it's just like putting on a cowboy hat. And if you ever seen, even a child puts on a cowboy hat, all of a sudden they're walking around a little tougher, a little Southern accent, and they become a cowboy. Even New York City has cowboys. But when you come to the Pinelands and you embrace the Pine Barrens and you see the culture, the Cedar Creeks, the food, the blueberries, the cranberries, it's a proverbial cowboy hat where people become Pineys. It becomes an all enthralling. I've been around the world, and yet I came back to the Pinelands to raise my children, and I can't see myself going anywhere else. Wherever I'm at, maybe on a mountaintop in Oahu, hiking one of the islands of Hawaii, and I see a pine tree, it reminds me of New Jersey and home. So it's something to be enthralled in, and it's something very magical.
Thank you for doing this. I appreciate it very much.
No problem. So the question, a couple questions on the chat. What happened to the dry flower industry? So great question. So 1994, John Richardson passed away. There was several different people. I'm working on an actual follow-up book to New Jersey's Lost Piney Culture. There were several different people who were buyers of the day. John Richardson was the biggest, also the longest running buyer of the piney crafts that were a part of that Richardson calendar, 101 different plants. But that industry died when he died. Literally, the other companies all folded up shop. Today, maybe if you go to a local florist, you might see some of those plants being used because the knowledge is still out there. The plants are still out there. But it was a long run in the industry that, you know, a lot of different factors. There's a whole chapter dedicated to this in my book, but a lot of different factors pushed it. You know, all of a sudden pine cones were being imported and local people, you know, couldn't compete against a cheaper pine cone being imported from other countries. And that proverbial fence that went around the pinelands, you became piney outlaws if you went and pulled pine cones in Warren Grove. You literally became an outlaw, and multiple pineys had their vehicles seized, the load that whatever the plant that they were harvesting seized. And it became harder and harder to find places that were open to you to actually be able to cut or pull those plants and sell them to the industry. So when I say the industry literally dried up in the early 1990s, it did. Another question was, are there hikes to see pinelands plants? There's a great website out there, South Jersey Trails. If you do websites, if you're internet savvy, South Jersey Trails has hikes all throughout the Pinelands. It's one of the undiscovered gems of the East Coast when it comes to hiking. Everything's right at your foot. I literally put out a book this year in March called Adventure with Piney Joe, exploring the New Jersey Pine Barrens. And it literally has a trail map of 31 different places that this magical gnome named Piney Joe is painted into. And he takes you to places that you can get out of your car. One of them is a beautiful boardwalk that you walk atop all these plants that I talk about, you know, that were part of the Richardson counter, but all these orchids that I love to go take pictures of that weren't harvested, those are there too to see. There's a lot of magical places in the pines. The last question there was, did the dry flower industry contribute to any plant extinction if they were over harvested? So that's a great question, because one of the chapters from my book, I talk about were Pineys the original tree huggers, the first environmental heroes. Because what they did for generation after generation, and they were able to still do it. So a piney craft wasn't a piney craft unless you could get a truckload of it. Because you think about just the practical aspect of, if you're going to harvest something, say corn, a field of corn that you planted, you don't just plant 1 or 2 ears of corn, right? The plants, and that's it. You have to plant a lot in order to be able to live off of the income that you make. So the same thing goes for that natural cycle, the Richardson calendar of the 101 plants. They weren't part of that cycle unless, one, they held up in the dry flower industry. Certain plants don't dry well. They literally shatter. So they had to be industry worthy. And then two, those plants had to be very abundant. So you had to be able to go out there year round, same time of year, and harvest birch whips, which is the young saplings of a birch tree. And those come back year after year when you harvest them. Certain plants like elk's horn, which is more commonly known as golden crest. Most pineys have a name for plants aside from the common name or the Latin name. But gold crest was a plant that was harvested that was very, I would say, you could prone to over harvesting. But the Pineys didn't, because they knew that was their livelihood. They always left some behind in certain areas just to make sure that the plant continued itself. But again, they would go back to the same places throughout the pinelands over and over to harvest plants that, you know, for maybe their grandfather told them, hey, this is a great place. They learned the trade. Even Bill Watts of it learned the trade from old time Pineys, and that industry sustained him and hundreds of other piney families throughout the pines. Any other questions? So Caitlin, you have everybody's names. We can do the raffle. And
Yes.
I see we got 6 minutes left here.
So yeah, real quick, William, I just wanted to thank you again for such a great presentation. I think you hit a lot of great points. So I just wanted to give you a round of applause.
Thank you.
A remote round of applause. And thank you again for your time. A lot of great questions too. So if you weren't in, if you didn't catch the beginning of our session today, we mentioned that we're going to do a quick raffle for William's book. So what's going to happen is I put everybody's names in a bag that I have in my office right here. It's something I used for an activity with kids, so that's why there's a flower on it, but I just found whatever was in my office. And I'll pick a name, and then if your name is picked, you will get a free copy of William's book. And you can pick it up at the Tuckerton Seaport this weekend. I'm going to write your name and phone number down and give it to the staff at the Seaport. So when we're all done, just hang out for like a few minutes when we wrap everything up so I can get your information, and I'll stop the recording and get that info. And then, you know, we'll talk about how to pick up your book. So let me shake this up a little bit.
Good luck, everybody.
Reminds me of the Powerball that just happened.
And so everybody knows, this book is actually 1 hour and 31 minutes and 58-second documentary that we submitted to the Garden State Film Festival. So potentially it could come to a theater near you in the future based off of the
Very
book.
exciting.
I'm very
All right.
excited. It's like a 2-year project. It's a very long.
All right, I got Marie Charity.
Yay, Marie.
You won. Excellent. And you can pick up copies of William's book at the Seaport too if you are interested in purchasing it. So Marie, just hold on a few minutes and we'll get your phone number and tell you what to do next. But thank you everybody for attending today's Lunch and Learn. Hope to see you at the December one, which is all about harbor seals nearby and the work being done offshore and if it's potentially impacting harbor seals nearby. So that should be really interesting. Let me know if you have any questions about upcoming Lunch and Learns. William, thank you again.
Thank you,
hope everybody
Caitlin.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no problem. Hope everyone has a great day.
All right, take care, everybody. Nice talking to you. Nice meeting you.